Right. Good morning. We're seeing some people logging in right now, which is great. Give a couple more minutes and then we can get started. Okay.
All right.
Yeah, we could
Are we
kick it
ready?
off, Danielle. Please go ahead.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to this webinar on how to avoid the high cost of tip mismanagement. We're very excited to be presenting this webinar with Atlas Direct Tips in partnership with the Restaurant Association of Nova Scotia. Afshin will be presenting from Atlas. He is the CEO and um, Atlas Direct Tips is a platform designed to make life easier with hospitality teams. So he's going to go over how managing tips digitally will support your team and yourself. And then we also have James Rode, who is our taxation lawyer specialist, and he will be coming in with some expert advice on how to manage the CRA and tipping as well. I will pass things over to you, Ashen.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Danielle, for the intro. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. For some of you, you may have seen part one of this presentation that we did last year. And for others, this may be the first time you're getting introduced to it. So a quick introduction on our side, as Danielle introduced. So I'm Afshin Musavian. I'm one of the executives here at Atlas, and we have one of our advisors, James Rhodes, that's joining us today. And the goal of today's conversation is for us to share details about tip management. I think everyone is really familiar with certain aspects of tip management, but specifically today we want to focus on some of the regulations at a federal and a provincial level that many operators have found themselves asking a lot of questions about. And unfortunately, there has also been a rise in audits by the CRA, so we want to really address that as well. So our goal really is that at the end of this webinar, you'll walk away knowing a few key points about how to manage a potential audit if you ever get that call, unfortunately. But with our insights, we're sure that you'll be able to handle it properly. And to tell you more about direct and controlled tips and help clear up any confusion about how your business and your employees can benefit from direct tips. And finally, we'll spend a few minutes on how Atlas empowers other operators across Canada and now in the US to manage tip management in a more cost-effective, transparent, and compliant way. So quickly about Atlas, we are a technology company. We are Canadian, based out of Toronto, and we build technology specifically for the hospitality sector. We have a few products. Ops takes care of day-to-day operations, really optimizing for performance, forecasting, checklists, to-dos, and a lot more. Tips automates tipping. That's the tip division, distribution, and compliance. And finally, we recently rolled out payroll in Canada, and we'll continue to build out solutions for the hospitality sector. Now, today's focus is on tips, and the emphasis here is that you could use whatever one of our products if it's appropriate for you. We're happy to help out with any of them that is a good fit for you and your team. Also, it's important to note that we do work with operators of all sizes. Like I mentioned, we do work with Canadians across the provinces. And as you could see here on this screen, we want to highlight that we do work with small single location operators, coffee shops, restaurants, Michelin star, multi-location, franchises, hotels, golf courses, wineries, and brew houses. I'm sure you guys have all experienced that across hospitality, tipping is prevalent, and managing tip management is super important for all operators and their team members. And we're very proud to be partners with RANS. They've been a great partner of ours now, and we continue to build out content for operators in the province. It's also important to note that we do partner with almost all of the other restaurant associations across the country. One unique opportunity here is that for RANS members, they do receive a 10% discount on our fees, but we can get to that all later. Now, when it comes to tip management across the world, whether it's Canada, US, UK, Caribbean, every operator deals with the same three challenges. It's tip division. These are the spreadsheets we spend time in. Someone really comes up for it, comes up with the formulas, and the rest of the team follows through. Unfortunately, manual entry leads to errors, errors lead to reconciliations, and more time spent doing things manually. Tip distribution has become a challenge. Pre-pandemic, we dealt with roughly about 30% in cash sales. You always had enough cash to offset the tips that were generated for employees. But unfortunately, in a post-pandemic world, now operators are reporting less than 10% in cash. So it means that they have to resort to going to the bank, standing in lines, getting the cash, getting cash deliveries, counting the cash. You don't always have exact change. Keeping track of what you gave and what's owed and so on and so forth, also very time consuming, tedious, and it does increase liability due to theft, insurance increases, and so on. And finally, while I know that most people are familiar with the challenge one and challenge two, challenge three is the one that we want to spend the time on today. This is around compliance. And compliance comes as at two levels, and James will get into that. One is at a federal level having to do with CRA, and one is at a provincial level having to do with the labor laws for that province. Now, I'll give this over to James because I think if we wanted to really bring this slide up, because if you were going to walk away with anything, we wanted you to walk away with the specific insight that, God forbid, if you do get the call from the CRA, what are the things that you should keep in mind? So, James, with that, I'll pass it on to you, and then we'll continue through.
So we going off the first webinar, we sort of went through the tests and all that, and there's a new audit that's happening now that's going across Canada. Basically, if an employee has listed, so maybe I'll step back and say the traditional audits used to be that they would go target an industry. They'd go into an area, say Niagara on the lake, and get all the restaurants in there at once on a same audit team who would go and look to see for compliance. And so there's a couple of compliances. One, they're looking to see, has people reported their tips? But as they're looking at that, then they're looking at the restaurant. Do you have a controlled or direct tip system? I mean, CRA obviously wants it to be a controlled tip system because if you put the tips on the T4, there's no more, tax evasion where people forget what they make during the year, which is very common. So that would be the first way. The second way that happened was if you let somebody go. If you let somebody go and they go to Service Canada and they say, hey, listen, I was, Service Canada will say, what were your wages? And then they're like, well, I'm in the service industry. I get tips as well. If they say they're in a controlled tip system, Service Canada then will then set up an auditor to go to the restaurant to determine whether it was a controlled tip system or a direct tip system. So that used to be the most common way you'd see an audit. The new way is that they're looking at line 10,400, which is also 1040, on the tax return. If a employee has put gratuities on that line, self-reporting, CRA under the CPP contributors program is now asking, hey, tell us about this amount. It's not really that hard. They'll say that they need to figure it out. It's really not that hard when you have a T4 from a restaurant, but they still call them, ask them, hey, tell me about this. And then, how is this calculated? How do you get paid? What's, the tip system like at the restaurant? So they ask the employee that they're talking to all these questions. So the first problem that I'm seeing is the employees are a little shocked when CRA calls. They get a little nervous. And so what do? They start giving very generalized answers like, I don't know. I think I just get it. I just get, how is it calculated? I don't know. I just get my amount. Those are the kinds of things that CRA actually wants to hear, because once they hear those questions, they will then talk to the employer. But that's the alarm bells for a controlled tip system, right? Where the employee doesn't know why they're getting what they're getting. They don't know what the division is. They don't know what who decided on the tip sharing. So this is becoming a huge problem in that I'm seeing it where you get these answers and then CRA is then putting it into rulings. So now the restaurant is being asked full questions about their tip system, but limited to that employee and to that year. But the issue is if you lose on that person, it can expand to a wider audit, right? They've now determined that your tip system is a control tip system. Every single employee getting gratuities in that, from that system for that year, the determination is now made, right? Hey, it's a control tip system. A rulings officer already found that. So this is the first thing I'm seeing is I'm seeing people they go to the ruling stage and they're losing the rulings, and I'm making sure that we object because they just think, it's just one employee. What's the big deal? And it's a much bigger deal because it's all employees. And then if you're part of a franchise, like I'm in one now where we're on our 5th franchise being looked at across Canada. So the first one was they lost the ruling. And I think because they lost the ruling, it then leapfrogged to the 2 other restaurants who were at rulings. So I won the objection, I won the rulings, and now there's 2 other restaurants that happened before the win on the rulings where you get a call from what's called the CRA Employer Services Office. That's the pre-tester. They ask those little questions to the employee and to the employer. Tell us about your system. How's it calculated? What's the payout? So, and I cannot stress enough that the people that you're talking to, they're ticklers. And I say ticklers, they're just like a litmus test. Is there a problem or is there not a problem? They are not knowledgeable on the gratuity systems. They've read the same 2-page thing as CRA. They just don't have the depth of the rulings officer. That's not their job. Their job is not to make a ruling. Their job is basically to be the litmus test to the tickler. Do I think this could potentially be controlled? If it is, then that employee that year they then seek a ruling from a CRA rulings officer. So you just have to be aware of how this works. And, I stress to the people and to the employees that I talk to how important it is to answer that employer service officer with correct, direct questions. Like, don't give nebulous answers, you give direct answers, because if you establish to them that, hey, listen, it looks like it's a direct tip system, that's it. That's the end of it, right? No more seeking a ruling. So this is a really big change, and I'm seeing it across Canada, and I'm seeing it across franchises where if they've lost one, then suddenly they're getting called up on other restaurants in the same chain. So just be aware of that. Is that?
That's perfect. Thank you. And I think it's, again, the call out, because as this slide also shows that, often these calls come and they come at a time that you don't expect it. And often they pressure for you to answer the questions on the phone. And as the slide states, you do not have to answer anything on that phone call, and you can ask for the inquiry to be sent out to you. James, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I cannot stress enough that on 2 of the rulings I'm on, they were pressuring the person to give answers. First, the employee answers, because I get their written, like I get CRA to force them to give me all their stuff in writing. But I'll see the answers from the employees, and it's usually a bunch of nebulous nonsense. Like, I don't know how it was done. It just gets told. I just get it. I'm worth more. But it was the employer. The employer is the problem I'm seeing with employers is you are not picking one person to answer all questions. First, if you have an accountant who you think is knowledgeable, make them your rep. And when the CRA calls, just say, listen, I need to bring in my rep on this to make sure that we give you the correct answers, because a lot of the answers too, you might not know, right? Like I've seen them ask the actual divisions between the employees, then the employer gets all worried that they have to provide that. That's actually not the case. Like, if you've got a tip system working out and the money's going to a committee, you might have no clue. That's the answer. I have no clue. There's a committee that gets this money, this bag of money, and they distribute it. But CRA kind of pressures you into answering it because a rulings officer has to make a ruling within a certain amount of period once they open the file. To me, it's to be honest, it's stupid. It's like, why don't we get to the truth? Why do we have to be pressured into an answers and then maybe get a bad decision, and then I have to go to objections and fix it at objections, which I do. But no one wants to pay me, and you don't want to get it wrong. but so just don't feel the pressure. Make sure that you have one person who's dedicated to answering it. And don't, I always tell people, just say, listen, I've got a rep. I need you to connect the rep. I'll give you your number. And that's it. Just if they keep asking questions, just hang up. It's very un-Canadian, but it's there's nothing worse than trying to be helpful when you're not being helpful to yourself and you're giving answers that can be misconstrued. It's not wrong answers, it's answers that can be misconstrued that I see are the biggest problem.
Mhm. And James, the question came in, and just to clarify, before the meeting, because I saw that there was an issue with the Zoom invites, I resent the invites via my own email to some of the participants who wanted to log in. And it seems like when they logged in, they're all now logged in under Afshin Musavian. So if you are seeing that under your name and you wanted to change it, by all means, you can. You just click on the three buttons to the right under More, and you could rename yourself there. Now, a question that came in is to clarify, a business is entitled to get details in writing. What about the employees? When the employees get a call, are they entitled to the same, or would that be a red flag for the CRA ticklers?
It's not a, I mean, this is the thing is I always, having been a Department of Justice lawyer, I don't know how many times I've been in court where something that someone said to the auditor got wrong. And then we're in court only to find out the auditor compared it completely wrong. And it used to anger me that it still angers me. So I asked them to put it in writing. And that's part of there's a taxpayer service code, and I can't name it because taxpayer bill of rights, because it's not a real bill and it's not a real right that's enshrined. It's mostly just PR. But you are entitled to say, listen, I want this in writing, especially if you have any kind of disability, right? Like if you don't hear things right, or you got ADD and your attention's distracted. These are the kind of things I always say this lightly. It's just that the CRA person is calling you because they got X number of time to get this file moving along and they don't want to write it up. So you are unfortunately telling them to spend more time to write it up, which is your right. So I always you have to kind of remind them sometimes forcefully that, listen, I want this in writing to make sure that I get it perfect. And I always say, you give it to me in writing, I will answer it in writing, and we will be on the same page, and I will answer it, perfectly for what you want. So employers and employees, they have the same Bill of Rights, right? The employers, taxpayers' Bill of Rights. And so I just say, you got to stand up and force that and say, I'd like these in writing. So in most of the times, I haven't seen the employees do it, but because usually they're off guard. But the employers, the rulings officers don't like doing it. So they sort of say, well, here's the questions that I'll ask you. And then by the time the person turns around and meets with me, and then we meet with the CRA, we know what the questions are going to be. So, but honestly, if you have a disability, it's like, just do not take no.
Got it. Perfect. And I see that some other folks are adding in questions. If I can ask, if you can please put in the questions in the Q&A. This way, other folks get a chance to see it as well. And once we respond to them, they'll be recorded and shared with others who may wanted to join but had a conflict last minute. And for this specific question, rest assured, the next couple of slides actually address that in more detail. So this is where we try to really give context of what is the whole requirement? Why is it that the CRA is calling? What are some of the questions that they're asking? And to explain this, we can go back in time. I'm sure some of these operators, you were around where everything was in cash. During the time where everything was in cash, if a patron came to your restaurant, for instance, or establishment, the customer would get a bill at the end of their experience. Now, they would pick up the bill. If they wanted to add a tip, they would add on top of it. So as an example, let's say the bill was $100 and the customer wanted to add $15. In those cases, what would happen is that the server would have picked up the $100, would have given it to the business. The money would have gone into the bank account of the business. The tip money would have been separated. Let's assume it was put in a mason jar, an envelope, but then the employees would have split it up amongst themselves. And in that way, it was much simpler in a way to explain the separation between revenues and tips. But the challenge is that in the post-pandemic world, like we said, 90% of transactions are on debit, on credit. So what ends up happening here is that the customer does the same thing, but instead of reaching for their pocket to grab cash because nobody carries cash anymore, they grab the machine and they punch in how much tips they want to leave. And here's where the digital traceability that wasn't there before is now there, because your point of sale system is the first system that keeps track of the sales and the totals. Then that gets passed down to the payment processor system. And then the payment processor goes ahead, processes that, and deposits the money to your bank account. And now it's your responsibility to be able to explain that, hey, that money that I received, all of it wasn't revenues. A portion of it was tips left by the customer for my employees. So you go ahead, take that money out in one way or another and try to give it to the employees. And this is where you got to be really careful, because now it's your responsibility to prove that that money was not sales and was not wages. So why is that important? Well, the way that these two get categorized for the CRA is that, well, wages by definition are paid by an employer. So whether you have an hourly staff or a salaried staff member, as soon as you put their total earnings on the payroll system automatically deducts federal tax, provincial tax. It deducts CPP and EI from the employee, and it also matches CPP and EI because it is a mutual contribution between the business and the employee. Now, your payroll system then goes ahead and remits all of those taxes on your behalf to the CRA. On the other side, tips. And we're going to put aside the topic of auto gratuity for a quick second. But tips, when they are left voluntarily by the customer and the customer is not forced or asked or made demands to pay the tip, this is a form of pay, but it is a relationship between the customer and the employees. Now, there's only one province in Canada which still requires the business to report how much tips the employees make, and that's Quebec. But outside of Quebec, everywhere else, the responsibility for reporting tipping income is with the employee. Now, we know that there are some employees that report and some employees that don't, but just talking about facts, if the employee did report, they will have federal tax, they will have provincial tax, but there should be no CPP or EI tax, roughly about 7.5%, because it's not a form of wage. And similar to that exemption for the employee, the business also doesn't have to contribute CPP and EI on the tip amounts. And that's what's super important about knowing the difference between direct tips and control tips. Anything to add there, James, before I move on to the next slide?
Well, the pile-on, right? Like a rugby scrum is, once you've got a control tip system, provinces now are under their workmen's compensation funds are now looking at the gratuities as a source of revenue. So, it's likely most will function on a control tip system, but it's worse now that they're all looking at verifiable tips, which is the gratuities that they see on your POS system, not the gratuities. So whether you have a direct or controlled, like I think in BC, they don't care. They're saying right now it's verifiable tips. But so that's just another thing to be aware of. Like if you've got a control tip system, be aware that you've got a contribution responsibility to your provincial workplace.
Exactly. So instead of only CPP and EI, there's essentially the WSIB or WorkSafe equivalent also added to the top of this.
And then Ontario, to pile on some more rugby scrumming, the employer health tax, right? So if you are above your payroll cap,
Million.
which I can't
It's a
remember
million.
from increased, but that was increased at the pandemic from what it used to be. So if you're over that cap, then a controlled tip system is subject to employer health tax as well.
Yeah. So all the more reason why you would want to ensure that your tips are not mixed with your wages. And here's actually how we explain this. Well, really, any business in Canada can add tipping. I'm sure you've seen tipping in all the places it doesn't belong. But in hospitality, we know tipping is a part of what keeps us competitive. So businesses say yes to tipping. Now, that is very much your choice, meaning that if your business wanted to say, no, I don't want to have tipping, and your employees complained and they went to the Ministry of Labor, there is nothing that can be done because it is a business decision to decide to have tips or no tips. But when you say you're yes to tips, then the business needs to make a second decision. Do you want to be under a category that the CRA refers to as controlled tips, a category they refer to as direct tips, or perhaps a mix, which is controlled and direct? And here I'll give a quick summary, but then I'll pass it over to James. Controlled is in the name. It implies that the business is one way or another is controlling the tips. Direct means that essentially, I think what most operators aim for, which is that, hey, customer, if you want to leave tips for my employees, that's great, but I don't want to have anything to do with it. I am just a conduit and the money flows through my business. And finally, the mixed one is, remember when I mentioned auto gratuity? We're going to bring that back in. You do have some businesses who have auto gratuity, sometimes for large tables, sometimes for private events, sometimes for catering, and then they have tips that are left voluntarily by the customers. That is what's considered a mixed bucket, really, meaning that you demand tipping in certain aspects and then you make tipping voluntarily in other aspects. It's important that if you do have any auto gratuity, you are charging sales tax on it because it's seen as revenue. You are also paying it out on payroll because revenue paid back to the employees is considered wages. So if you have any auto gratuity, you have a choice. You could either maintain the auto gratuity policies, but make sure that you clearly are separating them, charging sales tax and putting it on payroll, and then the rest of the tips can be inside the direct bucket, or you have a choice of removing the auto gratuity, allowing the customer to leave tips at their own discretion and avoiding putting those tips on payroll. James, over to you.
I feel like you said it all.
Perfect. All right. I'm learning more and more from you, so that's great.
So
Um,
wait, well, I'm just joking. Of course, I'm a lawyer. I've always got something to say. It's like the clock to bill you. So this is what I would say. My comment, right, is between controlled and direct, very easy. First, people always, I don't know how many, everybody calls me. I have a direct tip system. I'm like, you don't actually, unless you've got what's called a ruling, which is CPT one, you can do that. And I only do it in specific cases, and usually after we fix the system and we've let a little bit of time pass, then we do a CPT. Just you don't want to be, hey, you got a control tip system, and let's talk about the last, couple of years. So, but the CRA will give you a ruling that you have a direct or a controlled system. So, but other than that, it's just if you look at CRA's two-page sheet, it is a question of decision making, right? Like, do I meet all the criteria? And I can tell you the default is controlled. If you mess up just one of those criteria, you're in control. You might have a committee, but and that makes a decision, except that you have a manager who gets a gratuity under their contract. Well, technically, you've now controlled the pool because that manager gets an automatic share of the gratuity under their contract, right? You haven't really given the autonomy to the committee to make the full decision. CRA will find that that's controlled. Just the one manager will screw up everything else that you've done. So it falls to control. So you always have to be very, very careful about what you do and how it's done. Like one of the things that I'm seeing is back of the house, right? So front of the house tips out to the back of the house. If you look at the CRA's release, which I'm working to change, it acts like the gratuities belong to the front of the house, which they don't, right? I mean, tips are paid on a mixture of the product, goods, and services, right? So it's not just the server that gets the gratuities. The gratuities also to reward for the food and the drink. But you remember when you're talking to CRA, they've been to restaurants, but they've never worked in a restaurant. So when you're talking to them and they're reading off that list, you've got to be like, this restaurant is a team. We share the gratuities. When the server took the gratuities, they took their share and they passing the share of the, say, back of the house off to them, right? Versus what CRA hears is the servers, it's all the servers, and the server decided to give the back of the house. Now, if your restaurant has a policy, like a set percentage has to go to the back of the house, what does CRA hear? That you might have controlled that and forced that back of the house. So you have to watch these and make sure, hey, can we have the employees, this is why I always say you got to have a committee, unless you only have a few number of employees. And even if you have, like, say, 10 employees, I make them do an agreement and sign it. All 10 of you sign it. Otherwise, the committee's got to sign that this is the sharing that's been decided by the employees. Because CRA defaults to saying, well, I guess it's the employer. So that's where you got to watch these things. And the control versus direct, you got to be insanely careful on that, because it's okay to have the banquet room where it's under a separate POS and you pull the read and it's okay, that's a gratuity, where you've got a contract where there's a gratuity on the contract rate. It's the tables of 8 your main dining area, you have a table of 8, it's got an autograt, the CRA comes in and says, okay, there's an autograt on some tables, show me those tables. And you can't because you haven't actually done the work to ensure that you can show on your reads what were the autograts versus what were not the autograts, and the tracing of the auto gratuity into the wages of your restaurant to be paid out subject to EI and CPP. So I find that that's a big issue that I still see, where there's a blend of controlled and direct in the same read, and that's very, very, very hard thing to be doing, very bad thing to be doing, I should say.
And there are solutions for that. And that's what we're going to get into. But just to really now break down those specific things that the CRA auditors and agents look for, James helped us put together this table here. And in this table, essentially, as he said, the way that you can sort of work towards the most amount of protection is to consider that CRA's position is your tip model is controlled unless you can prove it otherwise. So here's how you would go ahead to prove it otherwise. And there are these 5 key questions, amongst many other things, but these are the 5 key questions that James had highlighted here. Number one, are the tips left voluntarily by the customer? And if you say yes to this, and the CRA agent takes a look at your, let's say, your reservation system, open table, 7 rooms, whatever, and on it it says tables of 10 pay auto gratuity of 20%, they're going to say, well, here we go. You tell me that there's auto gratuity. Can you show me how you separated those? And if you can't, then they'll say, well, we'll just assume that all of it is auto gratuity, putting the pressure on you to go ahead and come up with the paperwork to prove to them that no, not all the tips were auto gratuity. If you have a POS system that doesn't allow the customer to change the tips to zero, meaning that you've only given them the option of 15, 20, 22%, and there is no way for them to zero the tips, that will also be seen as you forcing the tips onto the customers, not allowing them to take it off. Now, some of our customers have asked this question of, you know what, for large tables, we do add the auto gratuity. But when we go to the table, we tell them, hey guys, auto gratuity's been added. If you want to remove it, let us know. And James, if you can share your insights on that, because that's come up quite a bit of times. Do you think that that's something that would hold up against the CRA's series of questions for a controlled versus direct?
I think that like the employee and service office, the first level will immediately say, you know what, we found something that looks like it's, because if there's an auto gratuity, there's automatically a control tip aspect to it, which means they immediately throw it into rulings. So you will be into your next step, which is you're getting a rulings officer, then asking for a breakdown of it. So that's the question, right? Can you show me I think your example was tables of 10, right? How do you distinguish between tables of 10 where first your POS should have been turning on the HST on the auto gratuity, right? Which I find that's a problem that I don't see that enough. That they're just not thinking about, hey, it's an autograt and you have to charge HST on the gratuity, because you're not charging HST on the gratuities at all. So that's your first issue. Now you've got an HST issue, which leads to an HST audit. So then the second issue is when you can't break out what the tables of 10 are and how that gratuity being subject to HST was also put into, your wages. I agree. CRA has what's called the assumptions of fact. It's the reverse onus. You're guilty until proven innocent. And it's completely allowed since the beginning of time in tax court, Supreme Court of Canada, because the taxpayer is the person who could best know what's going on. So they let the CRA do what's called assumptions of fact, because you, the restaurant owner or employer, are the only one who can really establish, hey, I had a direct and a controlled, and here's the tracing. So you just always have to remember you're guilty until you prove yourself innocent, and you've always got to be thinking that about your system. So, and I see that in multiple different things, like Ashton mentions, is a good point, right? It's on the website. I've seen it on menus, right? Tables of 8 subject to gratuities. That's all they need to see. If they see that, right? Will they put the work into it? That's a different question, because I'm like, if it's available to them and they find it, then you've just shown them there's an auto gratuity, and an auto gratuity means automatically there's a controlled tip aspect there. It doesn't matter that you had a committee. It doesn't matter that the tips are paid out at the end of the shift. You have a mandatory gratuity, which means there's a controlled tip system in play here.
Okay. And that's one of the most important ones. That's why we want to spend a couple more minutes on it. Now, these other ones really also are part of the ways for them to determine if you are controlling the tip. So they ask you, who came up with this division model? Whatever it is, it could be percentage of sales goes to back of house, percentage of tips, people pool, people want to divide it by hours, or whatever it is. They ask who came up with it. Now, with hundreds of customers across Canada and thousands of employees, every single time we know that the business owners and operators came up with this because they want to come up with an equitable tip model. But the important key factor here is you do want the employees to sign off to show that you suggested a tip model, but it wasn't you, the business owner, that enforced it. Because if you are enforcing it, then by definition, you're controlling it. So in this case, something that James had come up with is the opportunity for you to create a tip committee or a gratuity committee. Now, this committee, even at locations with 200, 300 employees, we still advise it to be a very small group. I think, maximum 7 people, but more likely we actually lean towards 3 or 5. And again, James will spend a couple of minutes on that. But the point of this is that one, you do want to have an odd number because you want them to be self-governed and they will vote on things. But there's one specific rule that you want to make unanimous, meaning that you want them all to come to an agreement to. This is why we normally recommend selecting a server, selecting a line cook or another kitchen staff member. And if your managers earn tips because they do similar work as other tip earning employees, then a manager could be involved. Now, these 3 individuals sign off an agreement that really says we got the suggestions from the business, but we're the ones that have approved this tip division model and we represent the best interest of the rest of the employees. James?
So to add to that, I mean, you just have to look at the case by Restaurant Omano, right? So that was basically it's the last case, that the big case on gratuities where it went to the Federal Court of Appeal. But if you look at the start of it, right? I mean, it's not the Bertuzzi Group's biggest restaurant. I mean, it's a great restaurant. I've been there. I took pictures after the case because I'm a nerd. But it wasn't their biggest restaurant. I was like, hey, how'd that happen? If you look at it, the insight is that an employee gave the CRA information because it was giving them information and saying things like the employer decided the tip sharing. And then they also provided information where I think the manager had said, if you don't follow it, you don't get any gratuities or you're going to get fired. So CRA, and that wasn't given by the employer. That was given by an employee, right? The employee had that email from a manager, and they used that to show, hey, you employer are forcing a gratuity sharing on the employees. The restaurant was, their defense was, we didn't. It was decided by the employees, but the problem was it was never in writing. They never had a committee or anybody that signed off on it. So you really need to do that. As I've done more and more restaurants, I really like the 5. Having a group of 5. 7 just it didn't work in the one I was looking at. 5, 2 front of the house, 2 back of the house, and then generally I put some kind of management person in the middle, like a floor supervisor. You could do a GM. I just don't like putting someone too high up on the totem pole into the employee matrix, just because again, CRA don't work in restaurants, and often if you're being looked at for, hey, what's going on in your restaurant, it might be because someone got fired. So if someone got fired and is telling the CRA all the nonsense about the general manager, and the manager is on the tip pool, the employee gratuity committee, not a good thing. But a floor supervisor, great, right? So you just got to sort of think about your audience, that it's not really the employees so much, which it is. Like, I like the employees also to like who's on their committee. So sometimes they don't understand a GM, but they know the floor supervisor because they're the ones that are cleaning tables or bussing tables to help them out. So they have that commonality. So I like 5, 2 front of the house, 2 back of the house, and 1 kind of management function. But the one rule that Ashton's right on is it's got to be, if they want to change that, it's got to be unanimous, because back of the house and the front of the house, well, the only thing they get along on is trying to get the manager's role to get, if the manager's getting some kind of gratuity, that's the only time that they can agree on something, is to give the managers less gratuities. So that's why it's got to be unanimous, is that I find that I've been in fights where we ended up having to withdraw a manager, and then we were allowed to leave keep the floor supervisors on. And that's kind of the problem, right? Is that the committee employers hate this. They hate when they do the handoff. All control is given up, and you've raised your restaurant from nothing, and you've controlled everything. And gratuities is an important part of your retention. And this is where it goes back to that initial decision. Do you want to do a control tip system or not? If you're going to do a control tip system, you totally can do whatever you want for retention purposes. If you're going to do a direct tip system, abandon all ye hope of having a say, right? You start it, you create it. We formalize the system, but once it gets going with the employees running it, it's a ship that sails on your, so, and that's what you need. That's what you need, unfortunately.
And that's 100% true. And I think maybe from a data perspective too, for again, all the customers that we have on our side, it's really been a very, small number, an anomaly, I would say even, where the tip model, when it was moved over to the tip committee, significantly changed and compared to what it was before. In most cases, we have either customers who have an existing business, who have an existing tip model, and the tip model transitions seamlessly, or we have brand new opens. The brand new opens, as I think everyone knows, there is a bunch of changes in the first few months, and as a result of that, you may make adjustments to the tip model itself. But in most cases, we do not see it. And the truth of it is, if your tip model wasn't fair, this exercise is not going to be what brings that up to your attention. It would have already been something that your staff would have been complaining to you about in the first place.
Yeah,
So,
I was going to add in all the ones I've done too, right, where I get involved in helping them come to it. It's always been accepted. And I've looked at them and sometimes the front of the house was unbalanced against the back of the house, and so I rebalanced it a bit. All employees eventually, came on. I say eventually because there was a little bit of issues at the start, but they eventually, okay, this is an understanding. And then I was trying to show them industry models, right, where their gratuity model was not a good gratuity model, and at the end, if retention crashes the restaurant out, they have to just be aware of what they caused. So I've never had anything dramatically change.
yeah. Okay. So with that, I want to cover the other ones and just being mindful of time. I do want to definitely make sure that you guys walk away with knowing exactly how you can manage this on your own. And if you are interested in us helping out, of course, we're happy to. So these other remaining ones really go hand in hand. Possession of tips at the end of the shift and processing of the tips to the employees. And really what that means is that CRA's position is if you have a breakfast shift, a lunch shift, a dinner shift, you do need to prove that the tips that the customers left were not in your possession any longer than the end of the shift. If we use the example of back in the day with cash, and let's say you had a mason jar, breakfast shift is done. You, the business owner, just need to make sure that that mason jar is in the possession of that tip committee. CRA doesn't care if the employees ended up dividing it up in that minute right after. They just want to make sure that you, the business, are not in possession of the tips at the end of breakfast, at the end of lunch, and at the end of dinner. And the second part to that is that, well, if you're not in possession of tips, then you shouldn't be the one that's processing it. So this is where some operators have come up with a solution of saying, look, we always carry enough cash. And what we do is at the end of the shift, we just take a look at how much credit card tips were due to the employees and maybe to one of the employees that we trust. We give them all the cash and then they can go and divide it up at the end. But the problem there is that now you have to deal with going to the bank, getting cash every time, making sure you have the right amount of cash, keeping track. Maybe the total tips were, $1,677. You only have 20s and you can't round it off. So those are the problems that you have to deal with. Otherwise, if you have enough cash on hand all the time and you can make sure that those cash amounts are passed on to the employees, you could manage this with cash if you wanted to. James, over to you there.
Yeah, I mean the cash system, is the time of old where we were at 90% cash, 10% credit card, right? And now that it's flipped, there is a huge problem. I find one of the biggest issues I'm seeing is the back of the house issues, because the gratuities that they receive are generally not a lot. That the employer is like, well, I'll help you out, and they put the gratuities, into an envelope that the head chef distributes every 2 weeks. And sometimes they're doing that because it's a fair system and that, Monday and Tuesday are suck shifts, but, Saturday, Sunday were great shifts. So if we do a 2 week and we average the shift out, everybody's getting a good share of the good days. What is CRA here? Oh, you had the gratuities past the end of the shift. That's what they hear. That's where they stop. Like I'm in a fight right now where it's like, no, they didn't even have like they're using an electronic system. It's the money like on the electronic systems, maybe I'm spoiler alert here, but the pre-authorized debit, it takes the money out of the employer's bank account before the tips are even left. I'm trying, sorry, I shouldn't do that. I'm just trying to get that into the CRA person's head that the money is already gone. It didn't even show up in the employer's bank account, technically, right? I mean, if they take cash at the end of the shift for credit card payments, then there's no way a pre-authorized debit is not the same thing. So, but the problem is they don't work in a restaurant, they don't get it. And I'm trying to explain to them that the back of the house tip that goes out every 2 weeks is off of a committee's payment. And that's why the employer has never had control or possession. But that's your problem, right? I see that a lot in restaurants where they're not even thinking about it. They're like, oh, back of the house, it's not a lot of money, it's in an envelope. And I'm always like, okay, where is it kept? Safe? Okay, who's got the keys to the safe? The manager? Okay, so now you, the employer, have only have access to the safe where these gratuities are left for your back of the house people that you distribute every 2 weeks. And so CRA is going to hear that you had control and possession of these funds, even if you're on a cash system. So you always got to be thinking these things like, okay, what do I do, right? And this is where I really like the committee and a pooled system where there's no more, put in the envelope for the back of the house. It's all just distributed at the end of the shift.
Yeah. And really, once you have all of these, then of course the paperwork is what makes all the difference, right? So like, if you have control tips, your pay stubs are your paperwork. If you have direct tips, getting that committee agreement in place, getting a governance document, something that James can help you out with in place, as well as ensuring that you have proof that the money movement was done to meet that requirement. So now I want to spend a couple of minutes in telling you how we manage this. Go
But I
ahead,
want
James.
there's a good comment there, and I've realized this more and more because CRA was kind of, I think, lax at the start. Is if you're on a cash system, and even I was guilty of it the first couple of systems I set up. Is so you pulled your electronic gratuities. Here's the cash. I give it to the committee, but I'm always like, okay, at the start, like I wasn't thinking of this, and now I've started really twigging onto it. How do I prove? How is I? Because I'm there to protect the employer, right? Mostly because the employer and the employee, it's a directive system. You all win. But the employer, the problem is I have seen the CRA go and say, hey, I see these gratuities coming in through your POS. I do not see them being recognized as revenue. Where are they? Oh, I give them over. I take the cash out and I give it to the committee. Do you have receipts for it? And that's a big problem in that I now have anybody's systems that are on a cash system. I make sure that they do a receipt system because previously it was like, okay, we always pay out 100% of the electronic read. That's the easy one, right? The harder one is when you're doing you server, you server, you keep the cash sales, right? The difference between the cash sales and the electronic tips, there's a differential. That differential we either owe you or you owe us. Um, and
To
so if
do
you look
that.
at Restaurant Mano, it's the you owe us. They gave out e-transfers on that, and that was what was really assessed, and that didn't even make sense, right, in Restaurant Mano. But and I just say that because if you're saying, if I was on TikTok, I'd be like, what the fuck? But it's how do you even get to a controlled tip system when you're looking at the tip out, right? The difference between the cash sales and the electronic gratuities. And it's that amount, right? What about the rest? What about the rest of the gratuities? All those other questions. So it was because the restaurant owed those electronic tips the next day and paid them out by e-transfer. That was the restaurant amount. So when you're in a cash system, it's always like, how do you prove that you paid out 100% of the gratuities to the employee committee for your protection? Because CRA is going to see that this revenue, like if they're doing a bank account analysis, right? They're going to see see your merchant account dropping all these gratuities in the bank account. And they're going to be like, wait a minute, your bank account doesn't balance with your revenue. What's going on? Oh, that's the gratuities. Okay, well, what's your proof for the gratuities being paid over to the employee committee if you're using cash? That's the, one of the huge benefits of an electronic system is it's all there, right? It's just another data entry. And to offset, this is where I see a lot of pushback on employees, and they just don't, because they don't understand it yet. They're thinking, oh, if it's electronic and you see the amounts, then CRA can easily trace it. And I was like, I got a news flash for you. CRA doesn't care. Like they don't put the time into looking at to see if the employee actually what they receive exactly. They make an assumption. Again, going back to that assumptions of fact. They just make an assumption of fact as to what you receive, and they let the employees prove it. Say, well, you prove what you got as gratuities. The cash system says usually nothing, right? And so this is where the electronic systems are actually a little bit of a helper, because if they do get an audit and CRA is making the assumption saying something like, well, I think here's your sales, you would have received 18%, because we can see the electronic tips, but we can't see the cash. But we're just going to assume that it was 18% being equal on electronic and cash, or worse, it's 20, you're a great restaurant. Do you have any receipts for payout to the back of the house? No, nobody has that. So we're just going to say it's 18% unless you prove that you paid out to the back of the house and prove that you didn't get 18%. Like, these are all the problems. And this is where, as I talk to employees, I'm like, the electronic gratuity system, I mean, is a bit of a saving feature, is that it's up to you what you report. I mean, can't tell you that what the law, the law is very clear to people. But the idea is that if anything goes wrong, you do have a very easy data, right? You can see what you get paid. And then the employer is also safe too, because they can see what you get paid out the electronic gratuities. So it's a very good audit saving feature. I'll say it that way.
Yeah. Okay. And I know that we're almost at the end of our time, so I just want to quickly go over how we help operators manage all of this. So like I said, the first one is really a business decision. Do you want to keep auto gratuities or not? If you do want to keep it, we can help you adjust your POS so that we allocate a POS ID or a department to take care of those large tables or private events to separate those tips. The second one around the tip division model, you want to establish a committee, a gratuity committee. In our platform, when we sign up, each location gets to have three types of users: the owner, the committee admins that have been selected, and the tipped employees. And inside the platform, those agreements are there. Owner just says we've established a direct tip system, we have tip committees, and we've selected Atlas as our trustee. Tip committee says we've taken a responsibility. We'll come up with an equitable tip model. And again, another key point, they too select Atlas as a trustee for money movement. And finally, the employees sign an agreement saying they're aware. And if they have any questions, they should go to the tip committee or go to Atlas. This is how the paperwork helps you support your case for ensuring that you're not controlling the tips. Now, when it comes down to the money movement, what we keep emphasizing is that the CRA just wants to make sure you don't have the tips in your possession as a business. Some businesses say, look, the credit card sales and tips don't even get deposited to my bank account for 2 days. Unfortunately, that is still not part of what they would consider possession of tips being passed on to the employees. They look at the POS receipt. If $200 of tips was left that day, they wanted you to prove that the tips were put in possession of the employees. So the model that James helped us put together is an advanced model. And what happens here is that in every case, what we set up is a structure like this. The business is on the left, the employees and the tip committee are on the right. Both parties have selected Atlas as their trustee. Now, we do an assessment with the business. We ask them, we know that tips fluctuate throughout the year, but on average, last 4 weeks, what was the highest amount of tips? Let's say for simplicity, you say $10,000 gets processed between Monday to a Sunday. We ask you for 12 or 13,000, just so there is a buffer. And basically that money moves from your account into a trust account allocated to your tip committee. And this trust account, our job, Atlas here, as Atlas here, is to ensure that the correct amounts are put aside. So as an example, Monday morning at 6 a.m., $13,000 is sitting there. Monday at the end of breakfast, $1,000 is owed to the employees. No problem. You'd already advanced this amount. At lunch, there was another 1,000. Again, you'd already advanced the amount. What our job is to ensure that those amounts that are approved are put aside for the employees for it to be distributed to them And now you have the luxury of being able to do distribution once a week, bi-weekly. We can also do daily, even at the end of each shift if you wanted to, but the most cost-effective way ends up being less frequent payouts, which means that you still meet the requirements while ensuring that your employees are getting a transparent deposit, reliable deposit, reducing your time cash counting or going to the bank or trying to keep track of all those payments. So that's how Atlas helps you manage all of this end to end. And the platform itself saves you quite a bit of time in the day-to-day operation of things. So again, that is the model, the business on the left, employees on the right, and the money movement for Atlas managed in the middle as a trustee to both parties. And that's how we meet all of those requirements. Now, I know that we're almost done here. So I did want to quickly launch a quick poll here that gives the participants a chance to win a $500 credit towards Atlas services. So if you can take a couple of minutes and just answer those questions for us, it's only a few questions, that would be much appreciated. And this way you also enter for a chance to win $500 towards our services. And as we're ending this, what I want to let you know is that this webinar was being recorded. So we'll work with Danielle and the rest of the hardworking team members at RANS to share that with you in a follow-up email. As well, the PDF I'm showing you right now will also be shared. And if you ever have any questions with regards to any of this, you can simply visit atlasrms.com and would be happy to set a time to go over your specific needs for your location and your operation. James, over to you. Any other final thoughts that you want to share?
No, I'm good. I think we had a big
Excellent.
one.
We'll also make sure that James's contact is shared with you guys. And it's important to note that, again, you do have the right to legal counsel if you're ever audited. So highly recommend it. If you have specific questions around, what your current process is, he's a great resource, trusted by many operators and almost all of the other restaurant associations across Canada. Couldn't stress that enough, and definitely a great person to work with. So
Almost. They're all on me. Oh, they're all on my side.
perfect. Is there any other questions that anyone wants to post in the QA box or the chat box? And we're happy to answer it, and maybe by extending this for another few minutes.
While we're waiting for people to ask more questions if they're interested, I just want to say thank you so much. Every time I'm on these meetings, I'm learning a little bit more about how tipping compliance works and the best ways to organize. And so thank you both, Ashton and James, for taking the time and really breaking it down in a simplified version, some very complicated topics. I also just want a reminder that last year we had another webinar from you about tipping clients where you did go into more detail on controlled versus direct tipping. I'm going to put a link to that webinar as well in the chat, maybe. And so feel free to take a look at it. It also, they provided us with a guide to restaurant tipping compliance with the CRA. So that is also available for anybody who is interested and wants to get a little more detail. Yeah.
The best one of the best comments I ever heard was Faciro was saying, he goes, "This is the most work I've ever done for not my money." And I was like, absolutely, that is the problem with the gratuity systems. It is the most work you have to do for what is not your money.
That's right. No, and when you even count the manual hours that goes into this, again, whether you're a salaried employee managing this or hourly, we can all agree that more time spent on the floor, more time spent on other activities yield higher values for your business, for your team members, rather than scrounched up in the corner trying to manage a spreadsheet, which unfortunately they're just error prone because you're doing it manually. It ends up costing you more money, and God forbid if there's an audit, then there's more exposure there as well. But all that being said, thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. We'll follow up with the winner of the poll participants, and they'll get a $500 credit towards the Atlas services if they'd like to engage us. Other than that, we're always available to answer questions. You could reach us at atlasrms.com, or for James, it would be taxationlawyers.ca. Thanks, everyone, for your time. Have a wonderful week and happy early holidays.
Bye.
Bye.